The first time HO Karen's son ordered me off my own dock, he did it with 6 men behind him, a county map in his hand, and the kind of confidence you only see in someone who has never been told no. He pointed at me and said, "You have 10 minutes to leave this property." I looked at the dock beneath my boots, then at the lake beyond it. Finally, I looked back at him. "You're standing on my property." He laughed. Then he made the mistake that would eventually cost his family everything. He called the county sheriff. What he didn't know was that I was the county sheriff, and the badge in my truck wasn't there for decoration. My name is Jack Mercer. I'm 48 years old, and I'd spent most of my adult life enforcing the law in Red Creek County, Texas. But before I became sheriff, I was just a rancher who wanted a quiet place to raise cattle, fish on Sunday mornings, and come home without someone telling me what I could or couldn't do on my own land. 5 years earlier, I'd bought a 40-acre property on the edge of Red Creek Lake. It wasn't some mansion surrounded by perfectly trimmed hedges. A weathered 2-story farmhouse, a red barn, a gravel driveway, a few dozen cattle grazing behind wooden fencing, and most importantly, a private wooden dock extending into the lake. My father had built that dock with me when I was 19. He used to say a man didn't need much in life: a solid roof, good land, someone worth coming home to, and a place where he could sit quietly and watch the sun disappear. After he passed away, that dock became more than lumber and nails. It became the one place on the ranch where I still felt like he was sitting beside me. That's why I nearly laughed the first morning I saw the HOA sign. It was planted beside the gravel road leading toward my property. Well, Tiom Cedar Redigis, I stared at it from my pickup. Cedar Ridge Estates had been built around the opposite side of the lake several years after I'd purchased my land. Large houses, private streets, stone gates, swimming pools, people driving golf carts around as if they owned the entire county. But my 40 acres had existed long before Cedar Ridge, and according to my deed, the HOA had absolutely no authority over my property. At least that's what I believed. For the first few months, they mostly left me alone. Then came the letters. The first one said my fence violated community appearance standards. I ignored it. The second claimed my red barn was an unauthorized exterior structure. I ignored that too. The third demanded I remove 2 old cottonwood trees near the lake because they supposedly interfered with the neighborhood's scenic corridor. That one went straight into the trash. Then, one Saturday morning, someone nailed a white notice to my fence. I pulled it loose. At the bottom was the name Victoria Hargrove, president of the Cedar Ridge Estates HOA. I knew Victoria, everyone in the county did. She was in her mid-50s, always perfectly dressed, always driving a black Mercedes SUV, and always speaking as if every sentence she said had already been approved by a judge. But the notice wasn't really from Victoria. It was signed by her son Ethan Hargrove. Ethan was 26. He'd recently moved back into his mother's house after leaving a real estate development company in Dallas. From what I'd heard, he had big plans for Cedar Ridge. Bigger houses, more lake access, a private marina, and apparently, my 40 acres were sitting directly in the middle of those plans. The notice claimed my dock was part of the shared waterfront improvement zone. I read that sentence 3 times. Then I laughed. The dock had been there before Cedar Ridge Estates even existed. I called Victoria. She answered on the 4th ring. "Jack," she said pleasantly. "Victoria, I assume you received the notice." "I did. And I'm wondering if somebody made a mistake." There was a pause. "No mistake." I looked out across the lake. "Your son thinks my dock belongs to the HOA. Our legal team believes the waterfront boundaries are more complicated than you understand. My deed says otherwise. Our attorney has reviewed the matter. Then your attorney needs to review it again." Her voice hardened. "Jack, Cedar Ridge is growing. We need cooperation from neighboring property owners." "I'm not a Cedar Ridge property owner." Another pause. Then she said something that stuck with me. "You will be?" I hung up. 3 days later, a survey crew showed up. 2 men in yellow safety vests walked along my fence line while a third person operated equipment near the lake. I drove over. "Can I help you?" The older surveyor lowered his equipment. "Jack Mercer?"
Yes.
"I'm Daniel Ruiz. We're conducting a boundary survey for Cedar Ridge Estates. Who authorized you to enter my property?" He hesitated. "That told me everything. I have paperwork," he said. "Paperwork doesn't give you permission to cross my fence." He looked uncomfortable. "I was told the HOA had access rights." "They don't?" He glanced toward the lake, then back at me. "Mr. Mercer, I'd suggest you speak with their attorney." "I already have." That wasn't entirely true. I had spoken with Victoria. But something about this felt different. Someone wasn't simply trying to pressure me anymore. They were preparing for something. I went back to the house and pulled my original deed from the safe. Then I pulled out the old survey my father had kept. The boundary line ran straight along the edge of the lake. The dock was clearly inside my property. No easement, no shared waterfront designation, nothing. I called my longtime attorney, Sarah Whitmore. She met me that afternoon. Sarah was 43, sharp, calm, and almost impossible to intimidate. She spread the documents across my kitchen table. "This is very clear," she said. "So they can't touch the dock. Not legally." That's what I thought. Sarah looked at me. "Jack, there's something else." "What?" She tapped the survey. "Your property line doesn't just include the dock." I leaned forward. "What else?" She pointed toward the southern edge of my ranch. "The HOA's new development plan appears to cross onto your land." I stared at the map. a proposed road, a row of luxury homes, and a future marina, all drawn directly over portions of my property. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Sarah said quietly, "They aren't trying to get your dock. They're trying to get your land." That changed everything. I called Victoria that evening. She didn't answer, so I left one message. "This ends now." The next morning, Ethan showed up. He didn't come alone. 3 black SUVs rolled through the gate area. A pickup followed, then another. 6 men got out. Ethan walked toward me wearing a white polo shirt, expensive sunglasses, khaki pants, and spotless brown boots. He carried a folder under one arm. "Mr. Mercer." "Ethan, you've been difficult." I almost smiled. "That's one word for it." He opened the folder. "We're prepared to make you an offer." "I don't want an offer. You haven't heard it. I don't need to." He stepped closer. $750,000. I stared at him. "For the dock, for the waterfront parcel." I laughed. "Which isn't yours." His smile disappeared. "You're making a mistake." "No, I'm reading my deed." He closed the folder. "My mother wants this resolved peacefully." "Then tell your mother to stop trying to take my land." One of the men behind him muttered something. Ethan raised a hand. Then he looked directly at me. "You're going to regret making this personal." I leaned against the fence. "It became personal when you crossed my property." He turned around. As the SUVs drove away, I noticed something strange. Ethan wasn't angry. He looked confident, almost amused. That bothered me more than the threats. 2 days later, I found out why. A county notice appeared on my gate. Notice o waterfront SFM&T. It claimed my dock was obstructing a public access corridor. That was impossible. I called the county office. The clerk searched the system. "There isn't an enforcement order under your parcel number." "Then why is there one on my gate?" "I don't know." I took a photograph and sent it to Sarah. Her response came within 5 minutes. "Don't remove it. Preserve everything." That night, I checked my security cameras. At 2:13 a.m., a black SUV stopped outside my gate. Someone got out. They walked to the notice. Then they looked directly into my camera. The person didn't try to hide. He simply stood there for several seconds. Then he smiled. It was Ethan. The following morning, I drove into town. I didn't wear my sheriff's uniform. I didn't carry my badge on my belt. I wanted to see how far they were willing to go without knowing who they were dealing with. At the county records office, I requested the original plat for Cedar Ridge Estates. The clerk brought out the file. And that's when I saw something that made my stomach tighten. The original development map showed the HOA boundary stopping almost 300 yards before my property. But a newer map showed the boundary extending directly across my waterfront. Someone had changed it. I asked who submitted the revision. The clerk looked at the document. Cedar Ridge Estates AOA. When? 6 months ago. Who approved it? She pointed toward the signature. County planning? I stared at the name. It belonged to a county official I knew personally. A man named Harold Vance. And Harold Vance had just become very interesting. I took copies of every document. Then I drove home. By the time I reached my ranch, another vehicle was waiting at my gate. This time it wasn't an HOA SUV. It was a county patrol cruiser. A deputy stepped out. "Jack, what's going on?" He looked uncomfortable. "I was sent to speak with you." "About the dock." I looked at the cruiser, then at him. "Who sent you?" He lowered his voice. "Planning department." I nodded slowly. "Does the order have my name on it?" "Yes." "Does it have a judge's signature?" "No." "Then it's not a court order." He looked relieved. "I didn't think it was." "Good." He hesitated. "Jack, there's something you should know." "What?" "The order came through with instructions to have you removed from the waterfront if you refused." I looked toward the lake, then back at him. "Who gave that instruction?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. I already knew. That evening I finally opened the locked drawer in my office. Inside was my badge, my service weapon, and the official credentials I hadn't worn publicly in months. I stared at them for a long time. I had spent years keeping my professional life separate from my personal one. I didn't want anyone saying I used the office to protect my property, but now someone was using county authority to threaten me on my own land, and that was no longer just a trade dispute, it was something much bigger. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. I made coffee, fed the cattle, checked the fence. Then I walked down to the dock. The lake was perfectly still. I sat at the end of the dock, just like my father and I had done decades earlier. For a moment, everything was quiet. Then I heard engines. I looked up. One black SUV, then another, then a third. They rolled through the ranch gate. Ethan stepped out. This time he wasn't carrying a folder. He was carrying a county-issued notice. Behind him stood several men and one uniformed deputy. Ethan walked toward me. "You were warned?" I stood up. "You're trespassing." He smiled. "No, Mr. Mercer." He held up the paper. "This time I'm ordering you off the dock." I looked at the deputy. The deputy looked at me. Then Ethan pointed toward the road. 10 minutes. I slowly reached into my jacket. Ethan's smile widened. He thought I was reaching for my phone. Instead, I pulled out my badge. His expression changed instantly. I held it where everyone could see. "Ethan Hargrove," I said calmly. "Step away from my property." His face went completely pale, because for the first time he realized exactly who he'd been threatening. And this time I wasn't speaking to him as his neighbor. I was speaking to him as the county sheriff. For several seconds nobody moved. The lake behind me was silent. The wind barely touched the trees. Ethan stared at my badge as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something less inconvenient. They didn't. "Sheriff Mercer," He finally whispered. I nodded. The deputy beside him suddenly straightened. Sir? I looked at him. Deputy Collins, did you know who sent you here? He swallowed. I was told it was a county waterfront enforcement matter. Did anyone give you a signed court order? No, sir. Did anyone give you probable cause to remove me from my own property? No, sir. Ethan stepped forward. Wet. This isn't what it looks like. I looked at him. Then explain it. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The confidence he'd arrived with had disappeared. I turned toward the deputy. Secure the notice and photograph everything. Ethan immediately objected. You can't do that. I looked at him. I can do exactly that. He took a step backward. This is a civil matter. It was a civil matter until someone started using county resources to fabricate enforcement against a private landowner. His face tightened. You're abusing your position. I almost laughed. You came onto my land with a county notice that doesn't appear in the county's enforcement system. I pointed toward the paper. That's not an abuse of my position. That's evidence. Deputy Collins took the notice. He studied it. Then his expression changed. Sheriff, what? This seal is wrong. Ethan went completely still. I took the document. The county seal looked authentic at first glance, but the date format was incorrect. The authorization number didn't match county records, and the signature belonged to someone who had retired from the planning department 2 years earlier. Someone had created a fake enforcement notice. That changed the situation completely. I looked at Ethan. Where did you get this? My mother. Where did your mother get it? I don't know. Then we're gonna find out? He stared at me. You're gonna arrest me. Not unless the evidence supports it. I stepped closer. But if you knowingly submitted a fraudulent county document, that's no longer an HOA disagreement. Ethan's face had lost all color. He turned toward the deputy. You're not seriously gonna let him do this? Deputy Collins didn't answer. He simply stood there. Ethan left. But he didn't leave quietly. Before getting into his SUV, he looked back at me. This isn't over. I nodded. I know. His SUV disappeared down the gravel road. I watched until the dust settled. Then Deputy Collins turned toward me. Sheriff, should I file this through the county office? No. He looked surprised. Why not? Because I want every document preserved before anyone has a chance to alter the records. He understood immediately. Someone inside the county government might be involved. That possibility changed everything. I called Sarah. She arrived less than an hour later. When she saw the forged notice, she didn't say anything for several seconds. Then she looked at me. This is much bigger than an HOA. I know. She placed the document into a protective evidence sleeve. Do you still have the original planning documents? Yes, and the surveillance footage. Everything. Good. She looked toward the lake. Then we stop reacting. What do? We'll build the case. That was exactly what I wanted to hear. For the next week, I said almost nothing publicly. I didn't confront Victoria. I didn't call Ethan. I didn't make threats. I simply documented everything. Every letter, every photograph, every vehicle entering my property, every survey marker, every county document, every phone call. And then something happened that I hadn't expected. My neighbors started talking. At first, it was just whispers, then messages, then people began stopping by my gate. One neighbor, Tom Reynolds, came by after sunset. Tom had lived near Cedar Ridge for 15 years. He leaned against the fence. Jack, you should know something. What? Ethan has been telling people your doc is already part of the OA. I shook my head. That's not true. I know. How? Tom pulled out his phone. He showed me a neighborhood email. It claimed the HOA had secured ownership of my waterfront. The message also said construction would begin within 60 days. I stared at it. Who sent this? Victoria. I took a screenshot. That email would become important later. Very important. The next morning, Sarah and I went to the county courthouse. We requested every public document connected to Cedar Ridge Estates. We found amendments, plat revisions, planning applications, meeting minutes, engineering proposals. And buried inside a stack of paperwork was something that made Sarah stop turning pages. What? She pushed the document toward me. It was a proposed waterfront development agreement. The HOA had planned a private marina, 42 boats sleep, a clubhouse, a lakeside restaurant, and a private access road. I scanned the map. The marina was drawn directly where my dock stood. Sarah looked at me. They've been planning this for months. How long? She pointed to the date. 8 months. 8 months. That meant the letters about my fence weren't really about my fence. The complaints about my barn weren't about the barn. The trees weren't about the trees. They were testing me, testing how much resistance I'd offer. And while I was dealing with their petty violations, they were preparing paperwork to take control of my waterfront. But then we found something even worse. A financial document. The proposed marina was valued at nearly $18 million. The HOA planned to sell development rights to a private company, and the company had already paid a consulting firm a substantial deposit. The property they needed. Mine. I leaned back. They were going to make millions. Sarah nodded. And they thought you'd eventually give in. I looked at the documents. They underestimated me. No, Sarah said. They underestimated what they were willing to risk. That distinction mattered. That afternoon, I received a call from County Planning Director Harold Vance. His voice was unusually friendly. Sheriff Mercer, I think we should talk about the altered plat. There was silence. So you've seen it? I have. It's more complicated than it appears. Then explain it. I'd rather do that in person. We met at a small coffee shop outside town. Harold arrived 15 minutes late. He looked exhausted. He kept checking the window. "You look nervous," I said. He gave a weak smile. "I'm not nervous. You are." He sat down. "Jack, Cedar Ridge has powerful people behind it. I know. Developers, investors, attorneys. I know. They've been pushing for this marina for over a year. Then why did you approve a boundary revision that crossed onto my land?" Harold looked down. "I didn't." I stared at him. "What?" "I never approved that revision." He pulled out a folder. "This signature isn't mine." I felt a chill. "Then whose is it?" "I don't know." He slid another document across the table. It showed the approval history. Someone had logged into the county system using Harold's credentials. The activity occurred after midnight more than once. I looked up. "Did you report this?" "I was going to." "But..." He hesitated. "My supervisor told me to leave it alone."
Ooh, he didn't answer.
I leaned forward. "Harold," he finally whispered. "Deputy County Administrator Marcus Bell." That name hit hard. Marcus Bell had been with the county for 11 years. He controlled budgets, contracts, department approvals, and most importantly, he had direct access to county administrative systems. I asked Harold one final question. "Why are you telling me this now?" His eyes moved toward the window. "Because someone tried to break into my office last night." My jaw tightened. "Did they steal anything?" "No." "What did they do?" "They opened my filing cabinet. And they left one piece of paper on my desk." He pulled it from the folder. It was a photograph. My ranch. My house. My dock, taken from across the lake. On the back, someone had written 4 words. "Walk away, Sheriff Mercer." I stared at it. Then I folded the photograph and put it in my pocket. Harold looked at me. "What are you going to do?" I stood up. Exactly what I should have done from the beginning. "What?" "Follow the evidence." That night, I went home and checked every camera on my property. At 11:47 p.m., headlights appeared near the western fence. A vehicle stopped. 2 people got out. They didn't approach the house. They walked directly toward the dock. One of them carried a measuring device. The other carried a metal case. I watched the footage twice. Then I recognized the vehicle. It belonged to Cedar Ridge Estates. I called Sarah. She told me not to confront them, so I didn't. Instead, I called Deputy Collins and 2 other deputies. By the time they arrived, the vehicle was gone, but they left something behind. A survey marker, bright orange, stuck directly into the ground beside my dock. It wasn't a normal boundary marker. It had a number stamped into the metal. Sarah checked it the next morning. That number corresponded to the proposed marina construction plan. They weren't waiting for permission anymore. They were preparing to build. I decided it was time to make the dispute public. I called a county commissioner I trusted. Within 24 hours, the county scheduled an emergency planning meeting. The meeting room was packed. Victoria arrived with 6 HOA board members. Ethan sat beside her. Marcus Bell was there. Harold Vance sat across the room, and behind them were several developers I'd never seen before. When the meeting began, Victoria spoke first. She presented the AOA's version of events. According to her, my property was historically connected to Cedar Ridge's waterfront. She claimed residents had enjoyed access to the dock for years. That was a lie. Nobody had ever been allowed onto my dock without permission. Then Ethan stood. He held up a map. "This isn't about taking anyone's property," he said. "It's about correcting an outdated boundary." I looked around the room. Nobody interrupted him. Then Sarah stood. She placed my original deed on the table. "This is the recorded deed." Then she placed the original survey beside it. "This is the recorded survey." Then she placed the altered county plat next to both. "And this is the fraudulent revision." The room went silent. Victoria's face changed. Marcus Bell shifted in his seat. Ethan looked at his mother. Sarah continued. "The revision was submitted without the landowner's consent." Victoria interrupted. "That is an allegation." Sarah smiled. "No." She held up another document. "This is the digital access log from the county system." The commissioner leaned forward. "Who accessed the file?" Sarah looked directly at Marcus Bell. "An account connected to the county administrator's office." Every eye turned toward Marcus. He immediately stood. "This is ridiculous." I remained seated. Then Sarah said something that made Ethan's expression collapse. "The same account was used to upload the forged waterfront enforcement notice." The room erupted. People started talking. The commissioner demanded silence. Marcus insisted someone had stolen his credentials. Victoria blamed the planning department. Ethan said he knew nothing about the paperwork. Then Harold Vance stood. "I do." Everyone turned toward him. Harold's hands were shaking, but his voice was clear. "I was pressured to approve this." Marcus shouted. "Harold, sit down." Harold didn't. "They told me my job was at risk." Marcus stepped toward him. "Nof." I stood. "Marcus." He turned. "This meeting is over." I looked at him. "No." He froze. I reached into my jacket and pulled out my badge. "This meeting is just getting started." The room fell silent. Then I said the words that changed everything. "From this moment forward, this is no longer an HOA dispute. This is a county investigation." Victoria's confidence vanished. Ethan stared at the floor. Marcus looked toward the exit. And for the first time, I saw fear on his face. But I still didn't know the biggest secret. Because when the county investigators later searched the HOA's office, they found something hidden inside Victoria Hargrove's private file cabinet. Something that proved the plan to take my dock had started long before anyone sent that first letter. And it had one name written across the top. Mine. The file had my name on it, not my property address, not my parcel number. My name? JQI Satai N Tarjay for several seconds. I simply stared at the folder. Sarah stood beside me. Open it, she said. I did. Inside were months of notes, emails, property valuations, photographs of my ranch, copies of my deed, and even a private appraisal of the waterfront. But one page made my stomach turn. It was a handwritten strategy sheet. At the top were 3 words: make him sell. Below that were instructions. Pressure him through the HOA, challenge his structures, question his dock, create enough legal expenses to make him reconsider. If that failed, escalate through county channels. Sarah slowly exhaled. This wasn't a misunderstanding. No, it was a campaign. I nodded. Then I found the final page. It was a projected financial statement. If they acquired my waterfront and built the marina, the development company expected profits exceeding $20 million. My 40 acres had never been the problem. They were the opportunity. The dock wasn't the prize, it was the doorway. And they had been trying to push me through it for nearly a year. The county investigation moved quickly after that. Digital records were subpoenaed. Emails were collected. Phone records were reviewed. The altered plat was examined by forensic specialists. And eventually investigators found the connection we'd been missing. Marcus Bell had been communicating with the development company through a private consulting firm. Victoria's HOA had paid the consulting company. The consulting company had paid Marcus through an intermediary, and Ethan had been the person meeting with the developers. The whole thing was designed to look legitimate, until someone looked closely. Then another surprise surfaced. The surveyor Daniel Ruse contacted investigators. He admitted that he'd been told to place boundary markers according to a map he knew was inconsistent with the original survey. When investigators asked who gave him the instructions, he provided an email. The sender was Ethan Hargrove. That email destroyed the last excuse Ethan had. But Ethan still insisted he hadn't known the documents were fraudulent. He claimed he believed the HOA had legal rights to the waterfront. Then the investigators found the payment records. Ethan had received a large consulting payment from the same development company. He wasn't an innocent son caught in his mother's dispute. He was part of the plan. The county filed charges against several people involved in the scheme. The HOA board faced civil claims. The development agreement was canceled. The fraudulent plat was removed from the county system. And the original boundaries of my property were restored. But Victoria wasn't finished. She hired an attorney and tried one final move. She filed a lawsuit claiming that the HOA had historical access rights to my dock. Her lawyer argued that residents had used the waterfront for years. Sarah asked me one question. Do you want to settle? I looked at her. No. Are you sure? Completely. Then we're going to court. The courthouse was packed on the first morning. Reporters were outside. Neighbors filled the benches. County officials sat behind the plaintiff's table. Victoria arrived wearing a dark blue suit. Ethan sat beside her. He looked completely different from the arrogant young man who had once stood on my dock and ordered me away. He wouldn't even look at me. The judge entered. Everyone stood. The hearing began. Victoria's attorney argued that the HOA had relied on county documents and had acted in good faith. Sarah waited patiently. Then she stood. She began with the original deed, then the original survey, then the HOA correspondence, then the altered plat, then the forged enforcement notice, then the surveillance footage, one piece at a time. She built the story until there was nowhere left for Victoria to hide. Then Sarah played the recording from the night Ethan had ordered me off the dock. His voice echoed through the courtroom. You have 10 minutes to leave this property. The judge looked at him. Then Sarah played my response. You're standing on my property. The judge paused the recording. Mr. Mercer, he said, why didn't you identify yourself as sheriff at that point? I stood. Because I wanted to resolve the matter as a private citizen first. The judge nodded. And when did you identify yourself? When they arrived with what appeared to be a county enforcement order. Why? Because I believed someone was improperly using county authority against me. The courtroom became completely silent. Then the judge asked, were you acting in your official capacity when you displayed your badge? No, Your Honor. Why not? Because I was protecting my property as a private landowner. The investigation began only after evidence suggested county records had been manipulated. The judge leaned back. That distinction mattered a lot. The plaintiff's attorney tried to argue that my position as sheriff gave me an unfair advantage. Sarah responded immediately. The defendant's occupation does not change the boundaries of his property. That sentence ended up being quoted repeatedly after the case. The judge reviewed the evidence. Then came the final issue. The HOA claimed it had relied on an old county map. Sarah produced the digital access records. The altered map had been created months after the original survey. Someone had intentionally changed it. The judge asked who had access. The county investigator testified. Then Daniel Ruse testified, then Harold Vance. Finally, the investigator presented the financial records. The room was silent. The judge looked at Victoria. Did you authorize these communications? Victoria's attorney objected. The judge overruled him. Victoria hesitated. Then she said, I don't remember. The judge frowned. That's not an answer? Victoria looked down. No. The judge asked, did you authorize the acquisition plan? She whispered, yes. Did you know the property belonged to Mr. Mercer? Another pause. Yes, I felt something inside me settle. Not anger, not satisfaction, just certainty. The truth was finally sitting in the room where everyone could see it. The judge ruled in my favor. The HOA had no ownership interest in my dock, no right to cross my property. No authority to enforce its rules against my ranch. The fraudulent boundary revision was invalid, the marina project was cancelled, and the court ordered the HOA and associated parties to cover substantial legal costs. But the judge wasn't finished. He turned toward the defendants. Property rights are not suggestions. His voice was calm. They are established by law. Then he looked directly at Victoria. No association, regardless of its size or influence, may simply redefine another person's property for its own financial benefit. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Victoria sat motionless. Ethan stared at the floor, and I finally understood something. Revenge hadn't been winning a courtroom battle. Revenge was making sure they could never do this to someone else. Months later, the criminal cases continued. Marcus Bell eventually accepted a plea agreement. Several HOA officials resigned. The development company abandoned Cedar Ridge, and Victoria sold her house. Ethan left Texas. The HOA itself survived, but its board was completely replaced. A new president contacted me. She came to my ranch one afternoon. She stood at the gate and said, "Misty Mercer, I'd like to apologize." I looked at her. For what? For what the previous board did. I nodded. Thank you. She glanced toward the lake. Would you consider allowing the neighborhood to use the dock? I smiled. No. She looked embarrassed. I softened. It's nothing personal. Then I pointed toward the water. My father built that dock. She nodded. I understand. That's why it stays private. She thanked me and left. I watched her drive away. Then I walked down to the dock. The sun was setting. The lake was orange beneath the evening sky. I sat at the end of the dock. For the first time in almost a year, I heard nothing but water. No lawyers, no HOA notices. No survey crews, no arguments, just silence. I took off my boots and let my feet hang over the edge. I thought about the first day Ethan had walked onto my property. The confidence, the arrogance, the certainty that money and connections could buy anything. He had believed my land was simply another asset on a spreadsheet. But he had forgotten something. Land isn't always about money. Sometimes it's about history. Sometimes it's about family. Sometimes it's about the promises made on that land long before anyone else arrived. My father had once told me something when we built that dock. He said, "Son, if you ever own something worth defending, don't defend it because you're stubborn. Defend it because somebody else may need to know that boundaries still matter." I finally understood what he meant. The next morning, I replaced the old weathered sign at the dock. The new sign was simple. PRMROCHUI no trespassui. Below it, I added one more line. Respect the boundary. I didn't need to mention the OA. I didn't need to mention Ethan. I certainly didn't need to mention the badge. People already knew. A few weeks later, Tom Reynolds came fishing with me. He looked around the quiet lake. Funny, he said. What? They spent millions trying to get this view. I laughed. Yeah. And all they had to do was respect the property line. I looked toward the horizon. That's usually how it works. We sat there for a while. Then Tom asked, "You ever regret getting involved?" I thought about it. No, not even once. I shook my head. Not when the truth was on my side. That afternoon I walked back toward the ranch. The red barn stood in the sunlight. The cattle moved slowly across the pasture. The wooden fence stretched toward the lake. Everything was exactly where it belonged. And so was I. I stopped beside the gate and looked back at the dock one last time. The OA had tried to take it. They had tried to pressure me. They had manipulated records. They had brought county officials into their scheme. They had even sent their son onto my property believing a badge was the only thing standing between them and victory. They were wrong. The badge never made the land mine. The deed did. The history did. My father's hands did. And the law simply made sure nobody could pretend otherwise. I walked inside as the sun disappeared behind the trees. For the first time in months, I closed the door without wondering who would be waiting outside tomorrow. And as I looked through the window toward the old dock my father had built, I realized the greatest revenge wasn't watching the HOA fall apart. It was knowing that after everything they tried to take from me, I was still standing on my own land. They thought my badge made me powerful. It didn't. Knowing exactly where the line was and refusing to let anyone cross it did.